that it's conducting an evaluation of the IMF's emergency response to the pandemic. So we'll be covering the period from March 2020 to March 2021. And we'll be trying to look at, how the IMF devised a strategy for helping countries during the pandemic, how effective it was in providing emergency financing, how it assessed the outlook for the global economy as well as for individual countries in the face of really an unprecedented shock, and a shock very different from the kind that the IMF is used to dealing with. So this was not just primarily a financial shock, more of a health crisis. And then we're going to also look at how the IMF adjusted its own internal operations, having to work from home, not being able to go on missions to the countries, how they were able to reorient their work program to such a change in their business practices. But the focus of our evaluation, is likely to be on kind of the provision of emergency financing in the initial few months of the pandemic. So our evaluations typically involve lots and lots of meetings and conversations. Many of them have to be confidential so that the participants can speak candidly and give us their views. But a lot of our evidence gathering is also can be done
directly share 3 key points and 3 asks about the internet.
Can folks please mute? There's some background noise. But some of our evidence gathering can be done in a more public fashion, taking the advantage of lots of people who can join in virtually. So this is really the first of an event of this kind to help our new evaluation. And I see there are many people joining from civil society, many of our friends from civil society. I would encourage you to contact us if you think you're in a position to help us with your thoughts and views on the IMF's emergency response to the pandemic. Again, will folks please mute if you're not speaking? Thank you. So today we are very happy to have from Oxfam, Nadia, Daar, and Nabil Abdo. Nadia is the head of Oxfam's Washington office, and Nabil is a senior policy advisor. Happy to welcome back to the fund Stephanie Segal, currently a senior fellow at CSIS, but who was at the board in 2004 to 2007, and then in SPR from 2010 to 14. And so very happy to have my friend and co-author, Pietro Pizzuto, who's on the faculty at the University of Palermo, and he has helped us at the IEO in the past, most recently with our capital flows evaluation. So what we're going to cover today is access, accountability, austerity in IMF's COVID-19 programs. As the title indicates, we're going to try to look at the numbers of how much financing the IMF has been able to provide, how much it has been able to provide compared to other agencies. We may not touch too much on accountability, but it's obviously a very important consideration. We may discuss it a bit during the Q&A. The IMF is continuing to work to improve the safeguards, the governance of the programs. Human Rights Watch and Transparency International just issued a report the last couple of days, also assessing governance, corruption, and safeguard issues. So we may talk about in the Q&A, but it's not going to be a big part of the official presentations by the speakers. We will talk a fair bit about austerity, since fiscal measures in IMF programs are always an important component and always provoke a bit of a debate between civil society and the IMF. So it's important to touch on this issue and see where positions are at the moment. So with that, let me turn it over to Nadia and Nabil. Over to you.
Thank you, Prakash. Thank you for inviting us to present some of the work that we've been doing. We were asked to come today to present our data set on spending accountability and recovery measures included in the IMF COVID-19 loans. That you are the first people here, the 91 participants here, the first ones to know and to see that we've actually just updated our tracker. And so I wanted to just give you a quick idea of what this work is. Next slide. So this tracker is really a data set that we have been using, and that began actually very organically. It was, where Oxfam has offices all over the world, and we had colleagues from Kenya, from Malawi, from El Salvador, emailing us almost every day saying, oh my gosh, the IMF has just approved a new loan in my country. What should we know about it? And so our team in DC started looking into these loans and trying to pull key information that we thought would be of interest to our colleagues. And then it evolved to people outside of of Oxfam asking us these things. And basically the demand was evolving to the point where we realized we had collated a huge amount of information, and we felt bad hoarding this information. So we figured, okay, let's systematize it. Let's look at all of these loans and let's get it out there. And it was really governance and fiscal measures, especially, that we were getting demand for information about. The IMF was actually doing a really great job and continues to do a great job, I would say, of putting updated information about its IMF, about its COVID-19 lending in a very clear table on its COVID-19 hub on its website. The point of ours was really to give people a quick snapshot view of what's inside the loan. So we were looking at governance measures and fiscal measures, especially, as that was an area of interest. And so just to give you an idea, this is a very basic looking table, but there's, hundreds of pages of this. And we look at the country, we look at the type of financing to give an idea of the instruments used. There's a column looking at debt, where that data is actually pulled from the World Bank. And then you have fiscal measures and spending that the IMF is supporting or encouraging, or that countries are committing to doing through in pandemic times. There's a transparency and accountability measures that are embedded in these loans, if there are any. And then the final column was one of high interest to many, which was looking at the proposed fiscal measures for the recovery period. And just to say, the way we did it is we didn't interpret any of this data. The interpretation, the subjectivity arises because we pulled what we wanted to. It's all manual excerpts, but it is actual text excerpts from IMF documents, and then we have the sources. So imagine this for every single loan that the IMF has approved in COVID-19 loans. Prakash, you'll be happy to know that we have the exact time frame that you are looking at, from March 2020, now updated through March 2021. Next slide. So what did we find? And this is the thing, we wanted to be able to give this data set to everyone to be able to use, so that colleagues or CSOs or even policymakers who were looking wanted to know about what was included in an IMF loan in their country could actually just go to our data set, click on their country, and quickly get a snapshot view with links, of course, where they can find all of the detailed information if they go to those links. But then we also wanted people to be able to use this to find trends. And for us, we found trends ourselves, and these were some of them. So the first one was looking at regional trends. And this is, I should say, our findings as of October 2020. Nabil will present the findings from October through March, which I think is instructive to see how things progressed. So from March 2020 to October 2020, we found that the most number of loans were to sub-Saharan Africa. The most amount of money was being committed to the Latin America and Caribbean region. We noted that most loans were in emergency finance, were using emergency financing instruments. And so that was the rapid financing instrument and the rapid credit facilities. We noted that there had been embedded more and more governance measures in the loans over time. So the first section of loans really had almost no governance measures with respect to anti-corruption and transparency. But very soon into things, around the summertime, you see quite a spike in governance measures included in loans. And I will say that civil society, I think, helped play a very positive role here in encouraging that, and the IMF did respond positively. I would also suggest, if you're interested in governance trends, especially to look at Transparency International's COVID-19 tracker, which is quite good there as well. We also noted that the IMF, as many have heard Kristalina Georgieva talking about governments need to spend, and keep the receipts. That did hold true when we were looking at these loans. That is what the IMF was proposing for during pandemic times, to spend, and governments were saying that they would do so on social spending. But the biggest and most interesting finding for us, but also it turns out for many in civil society and the media, was on the austerity measures that the IMF was proposing for the aftermath of the pandemic. So we found that 76 of the 91 loans that we looked at encouraged fiscal consolidation in the aftermath of the pandemic. So important to say, it was not encouraging austerity today during pandemic emergency times. It was encouraging it in the aftermath of the pandemic. And Nabil can talk a little bit more about the details of that. At least until October 2020, we found that at least 9 countries were proposing to or being encouraged to introduce or increase VAT collection. Some examples included Afghanistan, Nigeria, Sao Tome and Principe, and 14 countries plan to cut their wage bills, cut or freeze, I should say, their wage bills, including Tunisia, Barbados, and Lesotho. So that gives you a very general idea of the trends we found up until October 2020. And I see that our colleague Fiona has now put into the chat a link to our updated tracker. Again, like I said, you are the first to see this now updated tracker, and Nabil can present from here on what we found since October.
Thank you, Nadia. Put yourself on.
Please mute their mics if they're not speaking.
I think the moderator. Okay, cool. Thank you. So yeah, so like Nadia said, so we updated the tracker and the data set to include loans since September 2020. And actually, we have also included in our analysis or in our tracking new Article 4 reports that were published for countries who have received loans during this period. And especially because the Article 4 reports were suspended at the beginning of the pandemic due to the emergency. So we thought it would be also good because it would shed more light on country-specific recommendations, especially since the loans have been dispersed. So when it comes to the loans, since September, we have identified 18 new loans for 16 countries, and those amount to 18.6 billion, and the majority of which, 93%, go to the region, to 6 Latin American and Caribbean countries. And the others and also Sub-Saharan Africa also have received the highest numbers of loans of 7. But also, I mean, for Latin America, there is this biggest number in terms of amount, is because most of the loans that were for Latin America were not rapid financing. So it was more of extended fund facility or the liquidity line, etc. So, and we have found, so unlike the previous period, we have found a good number of loans who are tied to country programs and not emergency financing. And also 13 countries out of the 16 have previously received at least one loan since the beginning of the pandemic. So most of the loans were also supporting previous loans or also continuing programs that were already in place. So in terms of findings, so there was not, we found that all of the loan documents explicitly recommend or promote fiscal consolidation, except for Afghanistan, where it doesn't feature. But however, in the Afghanistan case, we have deficit targets that need to be achieved. So for example, now if we add the new loans to the existing database, instead of 84% of all loans recommend or promote austerity, we have now 85% in some cases, in a way or another. So and also, I mean, we noticed that there is a lot of mention for countries, in addition to fiscal consolidation, there is the mentioning of deficit targets, mention of fiscal rule and fiscal discipline, and some countries introducing new fiscal discipline laws, so sort of codifying fiscal consolidation. And the main findings where we found that almost half of loan documents promote a wage bill reduction or rationalization, either through containment of wage bill, or, for example, increasing or not indexing wage bill into for inflation. So, for example, in countries we found that if there needs to be increase in wages, it should be less than inflation, so the real value of wages could decrease, and all of that. And in some countries as well. So, for example, in some countries as well. So since the beginning of the pandemic, from the first loan, we have seen reduction in recruitment for for public sector, and also reduction in employment as well. So, and also we have also recurrent VAT increase, promoting VAT increase or introducing VAT, for example, for Afghanistan, or reducing exemption in other cases. And we have seen also mention of need for pension reform, social security reform for 3 out of the 16 countries. And also almost half of the countries, we have seen recommendation of reduction of public spending in terms of either investment or what's called non-priority spending or capital expenditure, and all of that. So we have seen this consistency in terms of calling for fiscal consolidation and further austerity. So, and if you want to look a bit closer to those findings, we find also one recurrent theme is a sort of optimism in terms of recovery. So, for example, we have seen the fund recommending or promoting early consolidation in the first loan, and then at the later stages in the new batch that we have seen right now, we see that the fund is no longer doing that because, or no longer doing that for immediately, because they expected that the impacts of the pandemic would wane or recede earlier, like too soon. So this was for example, Colombia and Benin cases were also stark examples on that, where consolidation was meant to begin in 2020. And then later on, we find that, for example, Colombia has relaxed the fiscal rule, and also for Benin as well. The consolidation was reinstated, pushed in a sense. And also, but also we have seen that this optimism is not very much moderated in the new batch of loans, where we have seen in 14 countries out of the 16 that the IMF promotes or indicates or advises that consolidation should either start this year in 2021 or in 2022. And in one or two cases, we have seen talking about 2023, which is a bit further, but still consolidation is expected to happen real soon as well. And also, like in some cases, we have seen, like I said, for example, for Paraguay, now the fiscal discipline law is even becoming more stricter than before the pandemic, which also indicates the trends that we are heading for. And for example, one example where Malawi, where also fiscal consolidation was not mentioned in the first rapid financing, neither wage bill recommendation or rationalization of wage bill, but we see it now. So here we see also the pushing it further, and also like revenue measures. Revenue mobilization also almost always consisted of broadening the tax base, notably through VAT and indirect taxation, and not reinstating new taxes or progressive taxation, which I'll go back to it now. But another trend we have observed is this continued also reliance on reallocation rather than redistribution. So the idea is that the policies advanced or promoted were more about shifting funds or resources from one source to another in terms to accommodate for social spending, and almost in most cases, it was through either reducing the wage bill and reducing subsidies or cutting subsidies as a way to reallocate funds to social spending. And not redistributive measures, for example, through solidarity taxation or improving progressivity of taxes, or for example, including net worth taxes like the IMF has been preconizing. So in a way, so we've seen that kind of shifting of resources, and also always the reduction of wage bill and subsidy was framed in a way as an exchange to increasing social spending during the pandemic, but also experience, and even in the recovery. But experience has shown that this is not always obvious in terms of consolidation targets, where we see that often, even if social spending floors are there, they are put at the back seat in order to meet consolidation measures or conditionality. And there is this sort of assumption that subsidy reduction, the savings would go to safety nets in terms of systematically, but also we have seen this is not the case in many of the funds programs. For example, in Jordan, we have seen during the fund's involvement during the last 10 years that both subsidy spending and targeting or safety net spending has decreased simultaneously. So we don't see it as obvious, and we are worrying that this trend might come back as well. So like I said, also progressivity in taxation has been limited to personal income tax, and almost always it's about introducing progressivity to middle income brackets rather than the rich or higher income brackets. So it is expanding the base of the PIT, the personal income tax, while focusing on middle income categories. And only in Costa Rica we have seen, for example, a mention of a luxury property tax, but not in other countries in terms of like taxes that were progressive and they target capital or they target property or real estate. And this is like, yeah, really also noteworthy because as a reaction of when we first released the data set or the tracker, we have the IMF has seen that no, we will that the IMF will focus on progressive taxation, etc. But this was not the case, even on the very high level at the managing director level. But we have seen that this is not really the case. However, we have seen some encouraging observations. The flexibility clauses to relax conditionalities in country programs have remained, for example, in Costa Rica or Afghanistan, etc. And also, the IMF remains insisting on increasing social spending during the pandemic, and also mentioning that they need to be protected even when the consolidation sets. And also in some cases, in at least one case, we have seen the IMF calling on building on existing social protection system and expand the coverage, and not only focusing on targeting and safety nets, as we often see the case, and we see that this is encouraging and we should be further developed to go more on universality and social protection rather than targeting. And also in Ecuador, we have seen that this is also worth noting that the fund conducted a distribution impact assessment of fiscal consolidation to see how this would impact inequality. However, it needs to be done better, more systematic, clear also, even in the case for Ecuador, because we have seen also some, in the Ecuador case, it mentioned, for example, that the wage bill reduction and reduction in capital expenditure would result in decreasing income inequality, which we found that it is surprising. I will not go longer. So, but despite these encouraging signs, we have seen that it remains short of what we have been expecting or promised, in a sense. For example, social spending measures remain compensatory and to attenuate the impact of consolidation in the future. And this is what we have seen pre-pandemic. Are we going to come back to this trend post-pandemic as well, and recovery, which is also worrying? Most pandemic-related spending measures will be rolled back at a time where pre-pandemic spending was significantly off the mark, significantly insufficient. For example, the commitment to reducing inequality index has shown that pre-pandemic, only 26 of 158 countries have been spending the recommended 15% of their budget on health. And so we need to work towards that number and not go back to pre-pandemic level. We need to increasing significantly. And also we have seen that while consolidation recommendations and deficit targets and all of that are really clear and explicit and put forward in the loan documents, the recommendations on social spending during recovery remain vague and limited to we need to protect it, we need to bolster, but not really explicitly and out there. And also we have seen also, which is worrying, that there is increased funds involvement in labor law reform, which we think also we need to flag, because this is not really where the fund should be engaged, especially in the absence of specialized organizations or UN agencies like the ILO, etc., where the decent work is a main concern. Lastly, I mean, issues of consideration. We think that the IMF need to spell out what they mean by when the crisis abates, when it recedes because it's all over. When will the IMF, and according to which criteria or basis or analysis will the IMF say, okay, now the crisis has abated or receded? We don't know, and it remains really vague, but it is repetitive in the documents. And also a question is, where ex-post audits reviewed prior to agreeing on second loans for countries? It is really important also in terms of accountability. And also, as we look forward, countries we expect that countries will structure debt, taking on IMF loans, etc. But we expect that many of them will have maxed out their access to emergency financing. So will the temporary expansion of access be extended as it is expiring next week? And finally, I would like to say that we are keen to hear your feedback, because we intend to make the database more accessible, the tracking more accessible and more to people and easier to look at. So it would be good also to hear from you what would make it easier for people, what would make it friendlier to the eye, and how to make it more accessible for others. And thank you very much, and apologies if I overstate my intervention. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nadia and Nabil. This was an excellent introduction to your database, which is, I think, a great public resource that certainly we will use at the IEO. Sure, on staff will also find it useful as a complement to their own efforts. And I think you've also given us a very good overview of your findings so far. So I think this is a great resource that you're providing to us. And thanks for using the IEO webinar to launch your update. I'll turn it over now to Stephanie, who in her opening remarks at least will focus quite a bit on how the funding provided by the IMF compares with that provided by other organizations. But then in the Q&A, we may also talk to her about her views on what the IMF has been doing to help the fiscal situation through its involvement with various G20 initiatives. So let me share my screen, even though Stephanie will be doing the talking. So let me go.
Thanks, Prakash. And very nice to be with all of you and see so many familiar faces. It's a little bit strange to be kind of on this side of the presentation and talking to the IEO. But just the origins of our tracker, actually very similar to what Nadia described. I think when the pandemic hit, there was obviously an understanding that it represented a huge global economic shock, and that there would be a need for a massive policy response, but what precisely that response would be and where it would come from and how effective it would be were all questions that we had. So we actually launched 2 trackers simultaneously. The first was a fiscal tracker that just looked at G20 fiscal responses. We kept that up until September or so, and then in recognition of the excellent work that the IMF actually does tracking policy responses, we suspended our fiscal tracker, but we've kept going with our what we call our IFI tracker, so International Financial Institutions Tracker. Prakash, if you go to the next page. This is a tracker that looks at the approvals from the international financial institutions. And in that set, we include the IMF, we include the development banks, so the World Bank and a number of regional development banks. And we also include a number of regional financing arrangements. So RFAs are included in our data set. So we're covering 16 institutions currently. Our data source, this is very low tech. We rely on the IFIs themselves to provide the information through their press releases. So we track the press releases. We don't include absolutely everything that any of these IFIs are doing, but if they have linked that support to a COVID response, then we've included it in our database. And so the data through year-end 2020, we have 1,200 entries, give or take, across these 16 institutions. We're moving to quarterly updates. So we don't yet have our first quarter update. That'll be coming mid-April. But on our website, you can get access to the data. All the entries are in there, as well as the links that we're relying on. So again, press releases are our primary source. We are contacted on occasion by some of the institutions to kind of clarify a certain entry. And if we get that clarification that we can verify, we adjust our entry, but that's kind of the basic format. And from that data, we're able to get a good view on what these different institutions are providing by way of support. So what we're looking at here, kind of the first summary slide, are the approvals. So I would distinguish here approvals from disbursements. We attempted to do disbursements, but the IMF is actually the only institution that's really straightforward that allows you to kind of track the difference between approval and disbursement. It's much more complicated with many of the development institutions, so we'll focus here on approvals. And this data shows that from the first activity we capture is actually at the end of January last year, when the ADB did a very small operation in response to COVID pre-pandemic declaration. I don't know if you can go back, yeah, to that. There you go, that slide. So this covers approvals from end January through year end. It totals to about 237 billion. And the results that really kind of leap off the page is this is very much a story of the IMF and the MDBs and the financing that they've provided. The RFAs, and we can maybe have a longer discussion about this after the formal presentations. I think there was an expectation, in particular after the European Euro area sovereign debt crises, that RFAs would play a much more important role in providing financing as part of the global financial safety net. That, at least to date, has not really been the case in COVID, but I guess it remains to be seen how much RFAs could provide that kind of financing. But it's really very much a story about the IMF and the MDBs. If we go to the next slide. So this is kind of a granular view of the institutions that we've been tracking. So I mentioned that we're tracking 16 currently. This slide shows approvals for 13 of those institutions. So I mentioned that the RFAs have not been particularly active. So we're also tracking what CMIM, the ESM, and FLAR, so 3 regional financing arrangements, but they have not had approvals. So they're in our database in theory, but we don't actually have any announcements to include. The 13 institutions that are here, again, it's that IMF number that kind of jumps off the page. And as Nadia and Nabil mentioned, about half of that number is actually in precautionary instruments. So it's approved, but is actually not been drawn. If you were to take that out of the IMF number, you'd be looking at around a $50 billion number, still kind of the largest single institution that's provided assistance. And then you go down to the next tier and you see the EIB, the European Investment Bank, and the World Bank as kind of the next tier down. And something to note, in a later slide, we'll talk about the distribution across different country income levels. But the fact that the EIB has been so active, and they've been active in providing guarantees, and being the European Investment Bank, they're providing those guarantees to many European countries, which are in a high income bracket. So we're going to see a bit later on that the amount of official sector or multilateral support is actually skewed toward high income and upper middle income countries. And the EIB's activity is actually part of that story. The other things that I'd kind of point out on this particular slide are some of the new entrants here. So I mentioned EIB and World Bank. The next tier down, you have the Asia Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And then you get to some of the newer institutions, and in particular, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and then the NDB, the New Development Bank. So combined, they've provided around 13 billion in 2020 in support. Those are institutions that aren't even a decade old yet. So we have kind of evidence of some new entrants providing official assistance in response to this crisis. Go to the next slide. Here we look at approvals by region. And again, Nadia also identified this particular trend in the work that they're doing. But the Americas here stands out in particular because of those flexible credit lines, the precautionary instruments that we've been mentioning. So in this crisis period that we're looking at, January through December 2020, there were 3 different countries that had FCLs approved, all of them in Latin America. So you had Chile, you had Colombia, and you had Peru. And in the case of Colombia, you had an augmentation of the FCL program. So that counts here as kind of 2 separate operations. Those numbers, again, I think combined that accounts for about 50 billion. If you were to take that out of the Americas number, just the headline amount across regions, Africa, Americas, Asia, Eurasia, you don't have a huge discrepancy, again, looking at just the headline number. If you look, as a percent of GDP on a per capita basis, you're going to see a great deal of disparity, but just looking at the absolute numbers per region, the real difference here are the FCLs that have been provided to Latin America. Next slide. So this is the one that I was referring to before in talking about the EIB, including this graph where we look at the funding approvals categorized based on World Bank country classifications for income. This was a suggestion to us by one of our advisors. And I have to say, when we did this work and then we looked at the results, in one sense, we're aware of the FCLs, we're aware of the activity of the EIB. And so in a way, you kind of knew that this might be the story. But there's also a story of the advanced economies in particular have been able to bring a whole lot of firepower using their own policies for their own domestic economies. And so thinking that, well, multilaterals are going to be there to support countries that can't really support themselves. And when you look at, in particular, the amount of financial support that has gone to low-income countries, it is eye-opening. And I think, it would be certainly interesting conversation for this group, but maybe interesting for the IEO as you do your work, kind of thinking about why that is the case. And I have a slide at the end here that offers some questions maybe to think about and answer that. But it is striking when we look at the bulk of support actually going to high income and upper middle income countries combined, lower middle income as well, receiving a great deal of support, but low income countries, it really stands out for the relatively small amount of financial support that they've received, at least thus far. And then the next slide. So this is not, the other slides I showed are kind of our standard updates. So if you go to our website, you'll see those graphs. They'll be updated for each update we do. We don't in that platform drill down on the IMF operations, but for this presentation, we did take a look at IMF operations, both by activity and then by the funding amount. And for purposes of this conversation, I think this was kind of the most interesting thing that came out of it. So if we look by activity, so the left-hand graph here, about half of the activity here is in the emergency facilities, the RCF and the RFI. And activity here entails a staff report and actual approval to the board. There are, I think it's about 80 operations here in RCF and RFI. And if you actually looked at kind of on a month-by-month basis, the level of activity, you see this huge spike in May. And that's when a lot of those RCFs and RFIs were actually going through the system. So in thinking about how the fund responded to the crisis, no question they were the first responder. I mean, it really stands out if you look at what the fund was able to do and disperse quickly using these emergency instruments. They were certainly able to do that. And that accounts for about half of the IMF's crisis activity in 2020. And then the next category down is debt service relief through the CCRT. So here again, in our categorization, we include every time a country benefited from debt relief provided through the CCRT, that was included as a separate operation. And these came through in two different slugs. The first batch came through in April, and then 6 months later, there was an approval for a second batch. I think it's 28 or 29 countries that benefit each time So this is another 50 plus operations of debt service relief through the CCRT. So that's been the bulk of IMF activity in the crisis period. So, you know, consistent with a story of crisis response, what is a much smaller portion of activity are what you think of as traditional fund intervention in crisis contexts, which are the programs, the SBA, kind of the workhorse program. We only count 4 SBA either approvals or augmentations through December 2021. We count, I think it's 7 ECFs or EFFs, so more kind of structurally focused longer term programs during this period. And then the FCLs, the 3 countries, actually 4 operations accounting for Colombia's augmentation. So what you think of as kind of traditional fund crisis activity is really not, I mean, the fund certainly did that, but it was doing much more through the RCF and RFIs and through debt service relief. If we then look at the right-hand graph by amount, it's an entirely different story. And this is where you see the FCLs. They're huge dollar amounts as far as the financing that could be available to countries if they need it. So again, this is the 52 billion or so that was provided to the 3 countries. Only one of those countries has actually drawn on their FCL, that's Colombia to date. But as far as the funding that is available under the FCLs, it's about half of what the fund has provided thus far in the crisis. And then the next largest slug is in that emergency financing, the RCFs and the RFIs. So it's an interesting contrast between these 2 types of instruments. The FCL, which is kind of the highest quality, most restrictive pre-qualification, provides the most funding, but it's for the fewest number of countries. And then you have the RCFs and the RFIs, which are basically available to everyone. And it's something on the order of 80 or so countries that have taken advantage of that funding. And that also represents a huge slug of the IMF's crisis response. And again, what we think of as kind of traditional fund instruments, the ECFs and EFFs and the SBAs, there's certainly funding there in normal times. You would say that that's, you know, the fund doing its work, but it's a much smaller percent of the financial assistance that's been provided. And the last thing I would highlight on this page is a really small sliver that you can barely see that is on the funding side, the by amount, that is the debt service relief, CCRT. So that, even though it's been more than 50 operations, the total assistance provided through CCRT is just under $500 million. So certainly significant money, but when you're comparing it to the amount of financing that's gone out through the emergency facilities or through the FCLs, it's just a tiny sliver of support. And with that, I just have one kind of concluding slide for discussion now or over the year and a half that you'll be doing your work in the IEO. I mean, one big takeaway in kind of the overall picture of where assistance is coming from, you have a few new entrants, but they're not really the entrants that, at least before the pandemic, I would have expected. It's more AIB and New Development Bank have provided a significant amount of financing, but the RFAs have really not been a meaningful source of funding and part of the financial safety net, at least thus far. The second point is the one I was just mentioning before. It's these precautionary instruments, the FCL in particular, but also the PLL and the SLL, I think is the new instrument, and then outright loans, the RCF and the RFIs that have provided the most financing or possibility of financing in this crisis period. And as different as they are, they actually have a couple things in common. The first is a lack of conditionality. So FCL has maybe ex ante conditions to qualify, but the disbursement itself is not contingent on any sort of conditionality, nor is the RFI or RCF dependent on certain conditions. And there isn't any phasing of disbursement. So a country could choose under either, I think, to only draw a portion, but there's nothing to prevent a country from drawing the entire amount. So you don't have conditionality or phasing of disbursements that you have in traditional IMF programs. And then the last point is the one that I mentioned in the country income page, is that relatively low level of support for low income countries relative to other income groupings, and asking why is that the case. And I think there are a number of explanations, but they could possibly include lower country need. So smaller economic size translates to lower actual need. I'm kind of dubious as that being the sole explanation, but that's one possibility. Or is it that the country's capacity to actually use funding is lower and therefore they receive lower amounts of funding? Is it a question of the country's debt sustainability? And I think anecdotally, we know that there are a few cases of countries that have not had access, in particular to IMF funding, because of debt sustainability concerns. Is it a question in particular for the MDBs that they're already at or near their country ceilings and don't really have the headroom to provide additional support? And in some cases, is the IFI's own capacity constrained? So are there some of the regional development banks that either because of, even prior to the crisis, were not able to get money out the door, or because of the crisis and because of work from home or remote working, they've actually just not been able to process loans? So I think there's a lot there for the IEO to dig into, and I look forward to following your work.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. This was really a fascinating look at the data on MDB financing. I think we'll have lots of questions, perhaps not time for them today, but we'll definitely follow up with you. I think you answered one question that came through the chat from Jeremy Cohen-Seton, which was your chart on the dramatic difference across country groups in the kind of in the amount of financing. He was wondering how that would look scaled by GDP, but you sort of answered that. I mean, it could be that smaller size is an indication of smaller need, but perhaps not. So that's a good sort of avenue for us to investigate, is what's the right number to scale the amount of financing by GDP, or some estimate of country needs and availability of other sources of financing. So that's definitely something we will look into in the evaluation. Another question I had, if there is time, we could talk about it in the Q&A, but perhaps we will follow up with you later, is whether, as you were going through these documents, you got a sense of any sort of kind of coordination among the agencies. Were they kind of aware of what each other was doing? Was there any sort of sense of, well, it's better for you guys to help country X and for us to focus on Y? It was, we realized this was a pandemic. There's a crisis like no other, as the MD has said many times, and everybody was trying to help, and we praise those efforts. But as we try to kind of draw lessons for the future, hopefully not a crisis of this scale ever, but there can be regional events, there can be epidemics, there can be other issues. One issue that we will look at in the evaluation is how do agencies coordinate when they are faced with a crisis? So maybe if there is time, we could discuss that in the Q&A. But now let me turn it over to Pietro Pizzuto. Pietro.
Yes, thanks, Prakash. Let me share the screen. So can you see the slides?
I can see it, but very small. Oh, now getting better, yeah.
Okay, let me do full screen. Perhaps now it's better.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Prakash. Thank you to the IEO for inviting me to this interesting seminar. My talk will have two parts. In the first, I will basically provide some evidence of the effect on the distributional effect of previous inequality and the role played by the fiscal policy in affecting this evolution. This result mainly draw on a forthcoming IMF working paper that we presented at the Fiscal Affairs Department seminar in January. Then the second part I will discuss the IMF's fiscal policy advice during this pandemic and the balance that the IMF seems to be trying to strike between short-term fiscal needs and medium-term fiscal sustainability issues. But let me start with part one. First, I will briefly describe the data, and then I will present our main findings. So the pandemics that we analyze are so-called also major epidemics. I will refer to them as pandemics for convenience from now on. And these are SARS, H1N1, MERS, Ebola, and Zika. According to the WHO, the most widespread was the H1N1. Let me say that all these pandemics are bounded from 2003 to 2016. Again, the most widespread was H1N1, and that affected 149 countries in our sample. Ebola instead affected only 6 countries, while in terms of lethality, the MERS was the most lethal one, with a mortality rate of about 36%. You can understand that COVID-19 is far more widespread than previous pandemics that we consider in this study. On the other hand, it is far less lethal in terms of average mortality rates. These pandemics have been also, the impact of this pandemic varied by region. You can see that SARS and MERS had a large impact in Asia, H1N1 in Europe, and Ebola in Africa, and Zika in the Americas. What we do in our paper is to construct two measures of the incidence of the pandemic. The first incidence is a 0,1 dummy variable that takes the value of 1 when the World Health Organization declared a country to be affected by a particular pandemic. And the second one is a measure that in some ways distinguishes the episodes by their intensity, and it is based on the share of cases relative to the population. What we do is to use a standard econometric technique like the local projection approach by Daar, and we estimate the distributional impact of the pandemic. Let me say at this stage that that the results are not sensitive to the use of to the choice of the incident measures. And we show some results in the next slide to provide some evidence of this. Our first result is similar to a result provided by John Rogers and co-authors in a recent paper, and is that pandemics, past pandemics, had an aggregate effect on the level of GDP. In other words, 21st century pandemics prior to COVID-19 led to a persistent decrease in the level of GDP per capita. And you can see that the effect is statistically significant in both cases. So using the 0,1 variable for incidence, and also when using the cases to population indicator. The effect is about 3 to 5% depending on the measure used, and as usual, the shadow area is 90% confidence interval, and the dotted red lines are instead the one standard deviation confidence intervals. But what we can say about the impact on the distribution, according to our estimates, we see how past pandemics have led to an increase of inequality measured in this case using the Gini, the Gini index. Particularly, I show here the effect on the Gini net, that is the Gini coefficient adjusted for taxes and transfers, but similar results are obtained when using the Gini market. Looking at the magnitude, we see that using, for example, the 0-1 variable case, we see that the increase in the Gini net after pandemics is about 0.4 percentage points. At the first look, you can say that this effect is not very larger, but it's worth remembering that the Gini coefficient are a very slow moving variable, and in terms of standard deviation, this effect is 1.5 standard deviation of the change of Gini over time. So according to us, this is a fairly big impact. For the cases indicator, the results are shown in the right-hand side chart and are fairly similar to the 0-1 case. I must say that we did several robustness checks to confirm the results, and these holds to again to several robustness checks. Looking at another indicator of the distribution, that is to consider the size of the share of income held by different sides of the distribution, our results are again confirmed, since following pandemics, the share of incomes that go to the top deciles increase, and those of the bottom deciles falls. This holds for the top bottom 10%, and also for the top bottom 20, top bottom 40, as you can see on the right side hand of this slide. We next turn to some of the channels through which this effect on inequality can occur. The first is to look at the job prospect of people with different degrees of education. What we find is that the job prospect of people with basic education fall after pandemics, while others remains mostly unaffected. And this happens more or less over the medium term. The second finding is that working conditions become more precarious. We observe an increase after pandemic in the size of the informal sector on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the share of self-employment over the total employment. So these are the main two channels that we found as channel through which the increasing effect on inequality occurs after pandemics. But let me turn now to the effects on the fiscal outcomes. We find that pandemics, perhaps not surprising, I will say, lead to a weakening in the fiscal balance on the one end. This is shown in the left-hand side chart. And on the other hand, lead to an increase in the public debt to GDP ratio. But we know all that the fiscal policy of the countries differs in good times, and also it differs in during the course of pandemics. So our question is if a stronger fiscal support can alleviate this adverse effect of pandemics on income inequality. So what we do is to use two measures of fiscal policy, like the fiscal balance as a share of GDP and the total health expenditures as a percent of GDP, and we modify the baseline specification to allow for the response of inequality to vary with the fiscal response. This slide presents our key results. That is, when there is strong austerity, there is a sharp increase in inequality after pandemics, and this is shown in the left-hand side chart. On the other hand, when the fiscal response is strongly supportive, inequality barely increases. And this is shown on the right-hand side panel. We also note that when there is austerity, the increase in the Gini net is about 0.6. That is percentage points. That is twice, more or less twice, the average impact we have found in the baseline specification. The results still holds when we use the other measure of fiscal policy, that is the health expenditures. When countries have a higher amount of health expenditures, inequality, we see no increase in inequality. On the other hand, when countries do not spend too much in health, we observe an increase in Gini net very similar to the previous case. As a final robustness check, we estimated again our model by quartiles of the fiscal balance. Again, what you can see on this slide is that when there is when there is a strong fiscal support, that is shown in this case in the upper left hand panel, there is little impact on inequality. On the other hand, as fiscal support gets more and more stingy, the impact on inequality steadily increases. The difference between the results for the first quartile and those of the fourth quartile are quite striking indeed. Let me conclude this part with our projection based on our estimations on past pandemics on the one hand, and on the the information about the cases of COVID-19. What we do is to project the evolution of the Gini with respect to pre-pandemic projections. What we find is that Gini will increase, according to our projection, by about 1 percentage point at the global level, relative to this pre-pandemic projection. Let me say that our estimates are like to be lower bound, since, as earlier noted, and as we know, COVID-19 is more widespread than the average health crisis in our sample. So, summarizing the key findings of our paper are that previous pandemics have been associated with K-shaped recoveries. In other words, poorer and less educated people have lost out in terms of both incomes and job prospects, while others have been mostly unaffected. The second finding is that a strong fiscal support has helped bring about a more equitable recovery. And finally, without an adequate fiscal support and other policy actions, we project that the COVID will impact inequality will generate, let me say, a sharp increase in inequality. But here the question is, will the past be prologue? I think that this is not necessary, because for two reasons. I think that the first is that the scale of COVID-19 has been much wider than previous pandemics. And the second is the fiscal support provided by countries and also international organizations has also been higher. Related to this point, I think that this could be an effect of a change in fiscal policy advice that now appears more supportive than in the past. And at this point, this question paves the way to the final part of my presentation, that is about the fiscal policy advice of IMF during COVID-19.
Pietro, you may have to go a bit faster. We only have about 5 minutes left.
Okay. My view is that IMF has paid increasing attention to inclusive growth. This is shown in this slide. I will go quick. This is a slide that shows the change in the interest of IMF economies using the subject of IMF working paper. After the Great Recession, there has been a huge amount of work done by IMF economists in their working papers. On the other hand, also the support of the managing director and the IMF in general through the statement and the Fiscal Affairs Department has been also wide. Another thing that IMF is doing in terms of advice to countries are the IMF special series, that are the so-called How-to notes, that are mainly about fiscal issues and pay a lot of attention to distributional concerns. What is important to me is that there are some external observers. We had about the CSIS COVID response tracker that compare the amount of financial engagement of the IMF with those provided by other institutions. On the other hand, there is another. There are other observers that track the IMF action, like the IMF COVID-19 Recovery Index of Gallagher and Maldonado Carlin. They are, I'm not going through their index, but they say that IMF is prioritizing health and social spending during the crisis. And again, we have the tracker by Oxfam that instead is critical about the austerity measures that IMF is suggesting or promoting in the aftermath of the health crisis. So the big question is whether the advices of the IMF, so from the reserve, from the economists and the corporate advice, is changing the advice at the country level. Why this is important? Because past IMF programs have likely ended up in increasing income inequality, mainly when they required a reduction in expenditures, for example, social spending. So the work of external observer is quite relevant. Is the IMF advice different this time? I think that it is too early to say if there has been a change in the IMF recommendation. Of course, the sustainability issues are there and cannot be wished away. My own personal view is that a personal look at the IMF country report suggests that the IMF is taking a Keynesian whatever it takes approach in the short term that is an unconditional, let's say, support to fiscal expansions. And in my own view, this is a change with respect to previous recommendation. On the other hand, in the medium term, IMF is taking a classical approach that is do fiscal consolidation to meet medium long run target in terms of fiscal sustainability. This is why medium term distributional impact of the proposed measures is often overlooked in these country reports. So to conclude, I think that this time can and should be different. For previous studies, we know that fiscal consolidation are detrimental to income inequality, but the policy design matters. Particularly the spending-based adjustment tend to be more costly in terms of inequality relative to tax-based adjustment. A recent note from the Fiscal Affairs Department that provide a guidance on tax policy reforms goes in the right direction if it ends up in improving the advice to countries. What I think it could be a good point for IMF is to incorporate in IMF recommendation a more careful assessment and discussion of the distributional impact of the proposed measure or required measure to meet fiscal sustainability targets. By this way, I think that the IMF recommendation can really strike a better balance, let's say, between distributional outcomes and fiscal sustainability issues. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Pietro. That was quite a useful and extensive review of both the importance of paying attention to austerity based on past evidence, as well as your views on what the IMF is doing at present. I think we are over time, but if the speakers can stay on, I think we could perhaps go on for a few minutes, at least having a discussion amongst ourselves, even if we lose a number of the audience. So let me turn to you first, Nadia and Nabil. I'm trying to see where one could sort of strike a balance, as Pietro was saying. So one thing that you highlighted as being promising was these flexibility clauses to relax conditionalities. Is that really the way forward, you think, or are there other things that the fund could be doing to strike a better balance?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is one of, thank you. I mean, this is one of the issues that are positive in terms of how the fund could try to strike the balance, but we think that more needs to be done. I mean, we have, like I've said, we have been noticing like a sort of implicit back to normal or back to business, in a sense where, you know, this repeated statement about consolidation should set in the medium term or when the crisis abates, but in the same time we need to have compensatory measures to cushion. So this, in this sense, we need to see this kind of approach change fundamentally, because it's not only about compensation, but it's about more progressivity to be included. So, like I said, it was really surprising that despite IMF repeated declarations about introducing more progressivity, we haven't seen much of them, especially after the last annuals. And one issue, I think, I mean, there is a lot of issues that we can, and like the issues about the impact assessment, distribution impact assessment. So, for example, I was mentioning Ecuador was good, but in a sense, it was a bit not strange, but like the impact assessment said reducing wage bill and capital expenditure would reduce income inequality. But but they said it is also difficult to quantify. So it is a bit, I think this needs to be done in a more systematic way and more methodological and with engagement with stakeholders and more if you want, serious in the sense. And also, like we have noticed that in many documents, like the IMF is branching out, not branching out, but in a sense talking about labor, about pension reform, about all of that, while it's not really the premise of the IMF to be supporting countries on this, especially as other agencies are really excluded. And here it's really important to have other stakeholders and all of it. So I think we need to change the framework of how we see recovery, and not just about increasing social spending, but it's how we frame social spending, about what we think about universality, and also the idea of significantly boosting social spending, because in many countries or long programs, or we see, like, for example, increasing social spending by 0.3% of GDP, or like, I mean, it's positive, but still very, very modest, that would not really live up to the next pandemic or the next shock that we will be. I don't know if Nadia, you have anything to add.
No, I think we covered it.
Thanks. So yeah, I think that's useful. I mean, as I said, it's good to search for areas where there can be some better balance or some compromise. So indeed, I think another avenue, which, as Pietro mentioned, one could explore, is having more tax-based consolidations, which are, the evidence, at least in the past, shows are less costly in terms of aggregate and distributional outcomes. So I think there's another area of agreement. On these kind of distributional impact assessments, I think they're quite difficult to do, quite costly to carry out, but they seem quite important. I know the IMF would like to do them, but often doesn't have the resources to really carry them out, and indeed should be working with partners to kind of do them in a more systematic way. Stephanie, did you have any thoughts on the question that I sort of posed to you? I mean, how do you see the split of support between the bank and the fund, the emergence of these new players that you were highlighting, the AI, IB, NDB, as well as the role of the EIB? Do you think that these are all things sort of in the right direction? They were needed? Anything that you would say for the future that we can draw from this experience of having so many people rushing to help, which was good, with the IMF as the first responder?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of material to keep a lot of people busy, but when we're thinking about the IMF's role here, it's always important, I think, to kind of come back to what is it that the fund, its traditional mandate, right, is short-term balance of payments support, and that makes sense, but it bumps up against the reality of the types of financing that it is replacing in a crisis context, and when it's responding to a short-term shock that will reverse versus longer-term structural sustainability issues. And I think that's a real challenge for the fund. I think it's actually two separate conversations. And the kind of support that the fund can provide to wealthier countries that have market access, actually it has to be short-term, that's geared toward sustainability, because the whole goal is for the fund to get out once market conditions stabilize, and that the private sector come back in, and that the fund is not bailing out the private sector. I think it's important for the fund to kind of hold on to that mandate, and that's why the fiscal sustainability concerns for those, I'd say, wealthier countries with market access are important. But there's clearly a role and a need for the fund to engage in low-income countries that don't necessarily have market access. And there, the sustainability concerns are still very relevant, but they're relevant in the sense of it's the official sector that's coming in to provide that finance, either there needs to be adjustments so the official sector gets repaid, or the official sector needs to realize going in that we're going to have to provide concessional finance or maybe just grant financing, because the country otherwise is not going to be able to invest the way that it needs to and also repay us. So I think they're kind of two separate issues, but they're both really important for the fund and the IEO actually to dig into and thinking about how it's responded to the crisis. And the last piece, I really like the direction that the Oxfam folks and you were taking the conversation about when you're thinking about kind of the sustainability piece and what structural reforms, it is, to me, the resource mobilization piece that has the potential to generate more resources in a way that doesn't worsen inequality in countries and can allow the country to actually move towards sustainability. And maybe this kind of progressivity piece that I think it was Nabil mentioned in his presentation, is the fund making recommendations that actually help raise revenues and also address the rising inequality that otherwise would result from the pandemic? I think that's a really interesting question.
Thanks very much. Thanks to all the speakers. Thank you, Pietro, for the review of the past evidence on fiscal policy and the impact it can have on inequality, and your thoughts on what the IMF is doing at present and trying to strike a balance. Nadia, Nabil, thank you for introducing us to your very useful data set. We will definitely be using it in our evaluation, and certainly we'll have more questions for you as we move forward. And Stephanie, also thanks for your data set as well. I think also will be very useful to us. I think we'll turn to you as well for thinking through some of the issues you raised about coordination and the way forward in terms of using more resource mobilization based strategies to both meet the fiscal needs of the situation as well as try to keep the distributional impacts muted. So thank you all again. Thank you for the participation from everyone. Sorry to run a little bit long, but I hope it was useful, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.